So, hello everybody, and welcome to Policy Exchange for this very exciting event on space, which is also very timely given the ongoing Galileo story, obviously. This topic has attracted massive interest, so it's absolutely fantastic to see such a large and expert audience here. Thank you all for coming. My name is Gabriel Elefteriu. I'm a senior research fellow here. I'm the resident space enthusiast, although my interest is driven more by security and defense aspects of space. So today we are discussing how can the UK become the European leader in space, and how do we build on the Space Industry Act. So we're talking about disruptive new space, the new technologies and the lower costs that are enabling new markets for space-enabled services, and also perhaps what could go wrong with some of that. And beyond that, I hope we'll also get to talk a bit about space as a dimension of UK national power, rather than merely a commercial opportunity. Finally, I should also say this is Policy Exchange's first foray into space, and thank you to Lockheed Martin for supporting it. Space has been coming very fast at the policy-making community and at think tanks in recent years, and I think it's fair to say that most of the discussion on space-related issues has been taking place so far, mostly within industry. And some very narrow segments of government, but there has been more institutional recognition of space in Whitehall in recent times. But we also need more discussion in Westminster. So we are pleased to bring space to Westminster. Although some who might be too exasperated with politics might wish to see Westminster to be launched into space far away from the Earth.
I'll go now, shall I?
We've got an excellent panel here today, which brings in the three key perspectives on space, I think. Government perspective, military, and industry. The military representative, Marshal is running a bit late. He will be here shortly. But could I just introduce the other two panelists? First of all, we're very pleased to have with us Jesse Norman, MP, who is the Under-Secretary of State for Transport, and in this capacity as Transport Minister, he was involved in the passage of the Space Industry Bill. There is no one more qualified to speak on today's topic from the government side. I should also add that he was an executive director at Policy Exchange many years ago. So welcome back here to Jesse Norman. We're looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about government policy and intent with regard to space. And of course, we're very lucky to have here today Patrick Wood, who will be a very familiar figure to many people in this audience. He's a veteran of the space industry, more than 30 years experience, I believe. And since last September, he's the Director for International Business Development for Lockheed Martin's Space Systems Division. So a global role. He's also UK Country Director for Lockheed Martin Space. He was previously CEO of SSDL, Satellite Technology, Senior Vice President of Airbus Defence and Space, and he had a long tenure at Astrium Satellite, where most notably, and quite relevant for the stories that you've seen in the press today, he was Skynet 5 Prime Program Director between 2001 and 2007, so a program that delivered the Ministry of Defense current military SATCOM capability. Okay, so let's get right to it. So we'll start with Jesse Norman. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gabriel, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along today. I must say, Policy Exchange has come an awfully long way since the days of yore when I was the executive director here, and it's a pleasure to be back. I'm normally talking about issues of history or, as it were, political philosophy. So it's a delight to push the frontiers a little with Gabriel and the Policy Exchange first foray into the outer stratosphere and beyond. Two or three things. One thing to say is I am, in fact, contrary to what Gabriel says, not generally the done thing to contradict your host within a minute of speaking, but contrary to what Gabriel said, far from there being no one better qualified to speak, there is a lot of people better qualified to speak this. In particular, my colleague Joe Johnson, who's actually the minister responsible for space. Joe unfortunately can't be here, and I had the joy of taking the bill through its second reading in the House of Commons, and so I have got some familiarity with the issues involved. And it's in that capacity that I'm really speaking. I think it's worth just pointing out that this most recent piece of legislation is a very important step by British government in accordance with its industrial strategy to start to re-energise, reinvigorate and further develop our already booming space industry. I think it's fair to say that this country is, by heritage, tradition, expertise, technology, environment, ambition, government support, probably one of the leading places in the world to do this kind of work. And I think there's absolutely no reason at all why we shouldn't become the European hub for commercial spaceflight over the next few years as it develops. We've obviously had a very significant role historically in thinking about space and space industry through the science and technology base that we've brought to it, building, launching, tracking satellites, and of course developing, in the early days at least, new rockets as well. So there's a lot of heritage there, but I'd like to think that the bill means that, or the act now means that we've got the most modern space legislation in the world as well. And I think that's quite a powerful combination to bring to bear when we're thinking about where the industry is going to go and what it's trying to do. Of course, that is only a first step, however. The real question is, what are the permitting and licensing arrangements that will allow space players in this new and evolving industry to really take the work forward? And we are trying to push ahead of that. My colleagues across in the Department of Transport and across government are trying to push ahead of that as we speak, and to work very closely with industry in inevitably an area where, as it were, the two sides of the equation have got to be cooperating. And in particular, we've been thinking about what should be spaceports, which are the most credible ones across the country, how can we create the right kind of environment commercially for them to flourish, how can we create the right kind of balance and resilience across the UK to allow that them to succeed, and to permit launching sites for our own domestic, if that's the word I really want, space operations. We've included a non-trivial amount of money in the industrial strategy, 50 million quid, to support that process last time round, and we're working very closely with the UK Space Agency to make those things into a reality and to use that grant funding to support business cases and to support commercial activity. But of course there's another side of it, which is the kind of interaction with international partners to try to ensure that we don't just get a domestic space industry that serves domestic needs, but we get one that also serves wider European international needs. And that's another important part of the picture. So I'd like to think that the government is absolutely got the bit between its teeth, is stepping forward smartly and vigorously to try to open up another commercial area. And if I can just be true to my own origins as a philosopher and historian, I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that it slightly undermines the, this is a bit of a esoteric point, but I just offer it to a Policy Exchange audience, which is there's often regarded as being kind of intrinsic opposition between commercial interests and the state. And the space industry shows why this is a very naive view of the world, because these rights wouldn't exist if they were not laid down in law. These possibilities require enfranchisement in statute to permit a level playing field on which competition can develop and a space industry in its next iteration emerge. And I think that's forward thinking by government, and I'm pleased to have been involved in instituting that legislation myself. Thank you.
Thank
Okay, thank you to the Policy Exchange and the guests here for the opportunity to talk about the UK space sector growth opportunities. This is a fantastic period for UK space. If we look at the last few years, the rate of acceleration of growth in that sector has been phenomenal. So I work for Lockheed Martin Space, so the largest space company in the world. I lead the UK country activities for space here. But I also have an interesting insight into the rest of the world as the Director for International Business Development, based here in London, but leading a team across the globe, covering the UK, Asia, Australia, Europe and the Middle East and the Americas. And that gives me a great insight into how well the UK sector is actually doing in the international world and some of the opportunities that we'll get as a result of the new spaceflight bill and some of the other growth that we see in the sector in the opportunity of future exports. In Lockheed Martin, we want to grow our UK footprint beyond the current 400 employees that we have working on the space sector. We want to build and design a system integration capability here in the UK. We're actively pursuing, as was said at the beginning, the UK's next generation of military satellite system called Skynet. And of course, we want that to be a fair competition. That's really important for us, that we want to see that there is a good competition on the next generation of UK military satellite systems. And that's not just for the space segment, but also for the very complex and essential ground segment. What do we bring to that? We bring a huge expertise in space domain security, space situational awareness, on top of our heritage of launching nearly 800 satellites into orbit. We want to bring that knowledge and capability to help grow the UK space sector and actually do that design and build work in the UK. We're also actively bidding for UK content on current European Space Agency missions, such as the Plato and Space Rider. That's also demonstrating our commitment to grow the footprint in the UK. But we are really excited about the opportunity for the UK ambition for a spaceport, and I think that is really fantastic opportunity. We've seen some great work by the UK Space Agency and the Department for Transport to enable that legislation to be brought into an act. We know we're still on the early stages. We know we've got a lot of future regulation to sort out, but I think we know that the commitment of the UK Space Agency is there to do that. And what does that help us? Not only does it bring us a commercial spaceport and a commercial launch capability, but it really stimulates the small SAT market and the downstream data services market, but it also enables those new entrants in the market with great payload ideas to find a mechanism for putting their payload into orbit, demonstrating that they've got a sound business opportunity and delivering that business case. And of course, I was expecting the comment about navigation systems. It's kind of a topical topic at the moment. And of course, we stand ready to support the UK government in the next generation navigation system. We know there are ambitions in the UK to develop a capability. We are the current leader in space-based navigation systems worldwide, both actual navigation systems, but also in what's called augmented navigation systems. You may have heard of our system. It's called GPS. So I've been in the European space industry for longer than I care to remember. I've actually worked on 7 UK military satellite systems related to communications. And the last 4, I was, as was mentioned, I was the program director for Skynet 5 for both the space and ground segment. That was a fantastic project for the UK. It developed an enormous amount of technology. That was actually quite some time ago. What we now have to do is help develop next generation technology and capability. And to do that, we've got a real ambition within Lockheed Martin to help develop UK jobs, UK capability to satisfy both the commercial market, the scientific market, and the military market. So what's the journey been like so far for the UK space industry? It started many decades ago with launches. that's actually where the UK space industry really started back in the 1960s and 70s. The last launch was in 1971 of a Black Arrow with the Prospero satellite. It was launched from Woolmerah, and that carried it very successfully into orbit. We became the 6th nation to be able to design our own satellite, design our own launch vehicle. And that was a huge sense of national pride. What I sense when I talk to people about the spaceflight bill and the ability to set up commercial launch sites, that enthusiasm really comes through with people. People are excited, both in terms of the commercial business case, but just the excitement, the added benefit in subjects around STEM and developing the next generation of STEM graduates and apprentices into the industry. So the UK today has got a number of very mature areas in space, and I think it's worth just reminding ourselves. We're world class in the area of science missions, science instruments, and payloads. We developed that over decades of work, mostly on the European Space Agency projects, and that's been systems which have been predominantly about observing the Earth, but also about exploring our own solar system, but also going into deep space exploration. We're also experts in space engineering, research, and technology. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the universities and how closely the universities have been working with industry over the last several decades to develop that capability. And we see the next generation of that research going on today with 5G technology, and how will that expand? Yes, 5G is predominantly talked about in the terrestrial world, but in the future that will also go into the space domain. Telecommunications, both commercial and military. The UK has been a world leader in building space-based communication satellites. In fact, for many years, we've built almost 25% of the world's telecommunication satellites. The subject of navigation, we have an enormous heritage in both the space and ground segment for navigation systems. And that expertise is not just in the commercial use of space navigation, but it's also in the protected signals, which is one of the key aspects of navigation as we go forward. And those are the systems those are the areas that we've been very mature at over the last several decades. But in recent years, we've seen a growth in a number of new areas. Earth observation and the exploitation of that data has become a key growth vector for the UK. Human spaceflight. Tim Peake has been inspirational to students across the UK, but also furthered UK research in space and human spaceflight. Those are topics that we weren't actively involved in prior to the excitement of Tim going up to the International Space Station. And again, I come back to UK launch, the re-energising of the UK launch ambitions, the building of UK-based spaceports, and the consequent stimulation of the growth in small satellites. The time to market is now critical for this activity for UK launch. We need to be aware that there are others in Europe that have exactly the same ambition, but also across the globe. So time to market is one of my key messages in our need to press on with the assessment of the spaceport and the spaceflight bill. So we have all the ingredients for a very active space environment. We have an ambition of wanting to have 10% of the global market in space by 2030. We should continue to stretch that goal and actually become the leader of space in Europe. We have a healthy mix of science, commercial, and military capability. We have a close working relationship between industry and academia. We have active venture capitalists in the UK who are supporting new entrants and great new business opportunities. We have a very active STEM agenda in the UK, supporting apprenticeships and graduates and PhDs. We have a plan to build a national space test facility at Harwell, not just for small satellites, but also for large satellites. We get great support from BEIS, UK Space Agency, Department of International Trade, MOD, Department for Transport, and the Cabinet Office. And space is recognised as vital to our economy and the key national infrastructure. We are an active member of the European Space Agency in all aspects. And in fact, in most of the recent budget rounds, we've been the third or fourth contributor to the European Space Agency by country. This should continue post-Brexit, but more UK national missions would further stimulate growth here in the UK. The UK Space Agency is very supportive of new opportunities, actively supports exports with the Department of International Trade, and stimulates new entrants into the UK space industry. And again, the UK Space Agency and the Department for Transport have been hugely supportive of the UK commercial spaceport initiative. But again, I come back to the message, speed is key, rapid decision making is essential, and we need that efficient regulation that's going to ensure that this is commercially competitive. So we have the ambition and the drive to grow further in the space industry, but the rest of the world are very ambitious, and I can tell you they're very active. We can succeed by working together to grow the UK space industry and become the leader in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and
It's good timing.
right on time. Air Marshal Stringer has joined us. Could I introduce him very briefly? He is one of the most senior, most experienced officers in the RAF. He currently serves as Director General Defence Academy and Director General Joint Force Development. And from 2015 to 17, at the height of the air war against ISIS, he was Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff for Operations. And in this role, he has also had responsibility for space, among others. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have him here to explore space from a military angle as well, and what space means for national power.
Thank you. I'd like to say that was a wonderful demonstration of just-in-time delivery. I haven't lost my skills for time on target, but actually that's a pure fluke. I'm very sorry I'm late. The flight was cancelled totally this morning from Edinburgh, so I rather raced down. What is a drone? That might sound an odd way to start off, because most people would say, well, it's a sort of aeroplane, and then you get into all sorts of awful policy questions. I would say drone is up to, I'll name a figure, 10,000 mile space and cyber connection that just actually has a rather simple aeromechanical platform at the other end that does the last couple of 100 miles of what you need it to do. And so that is just one example of how space has become something we absolutely depend on across the military. I think someone calculated the other day something like 97% of all military activity at some point has space in it. And people don't really realise that. There's a lovely quote from a US Marine. He said, "Space, why do I need space? Just give me my boots, my rifle, my GPS." But our approach to space in the military, I think, touched on a lot of themes which, had I been here on time, I would have heard the other panelists talk about. We're absolutely international by design, and everything depends on our relationship with the whole force, which clearly is contractors and industry. What do I mean by international by design? Well, since 2014, I think it was September 2014, I signed off, and disclosure alert, actually I'm getting back into being a space expert. Now I've got Joint Force Design as my responsibility, but 3 years ago I was the MOD's senior responsible owner and did a heck of a lot of space at that point. And we signed off the combined space operating concept, originally with the Five Eyes countries and then including the European partners. And that is building resilience into space ops, if nothing else. Actually, we've got 7 or 13 or 28, however many flags on the side of a satellite. It makes it much more difficult for anybody to interfere with them. We share all sorts of capabilities, and therefore we build redundancy and we build resilience very much into our systems. Where we are going with space at the moment, well, I made it my job as senior responsible owner to get rid of my post, not because I wasn't interested in it. I found it one of the more fascinating briefs when I was the Assistant Chief of the Air Force, but it tells you where space was even only a couple of years ago in the MOD, that you could have a senior responsible owner, actually a construct for bringing something transient into service, and leave it with an Assistant Chief of one of the services, which is where it had languished. I couldn't even track back how many of my predecessors had it, because there was an assumption, an easy assumption, I suppose this is the one point I'm going to make, that space was just something that happened, back to my US Marine story at the start. Space was largely looked by technical people who you never saw, and you could just rely on it. We had contracts with things like Skynet, and GPS just worked, you turned it on, it worked, you cursed if it didn't, and we didn't really think about it. Space is now very much a contested environment for us, for reasons I don't need to go into with this audience. And so I thought we need to mainstream this capacity, and we have done that. So I've gone from a position of finding it difficult to offload the responsibility into the core business of the MOD to now having two elements of the MOD in a good way, fighting over it. The Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Stephen Hillier, absolutely now has embraced space as a core part of the sort of aerospace offer from the Royal Air Force, and my immediate boss, General Chris Gabriel, as Joint Force Commander, absolutely has gripped what we would refer to as the joint user, because of course, as I said, everybody, 97% of all military activities rely on space. And back to that international by design and the Five Eyes, we end up making some quite good trades. I mean, there are all sorts of useful, almost accidents of geography of bits and pieces that we own around the world. And I'll only mention one, which is Fylingdales up in North Yorkshire. It's interesting, as I said, we just took things for granted, but the status of the radar at Fylingdales in North Yorkshire is briefed every morning to at least 2 US 4-star combatant commanders. It plays such a vital role in everything they do and maintaining readiness. And then you play with that radar a bit more, and you suddenly find you can do all sorts of things to do with space situational awareness. And you pull that one out, and you find space situational awareness. If you make it available to industry, you can save on satellite wear and tear, etc., etc. You fold space weather into that, and suddenly you can do lots of useful things if you think more broadly across the UK enterprise. And for sharing that with our Five Eyes colleagues, we get several billions. I haven't got the latest updated figure. It's in the low billions of pounds worth of imagery just from the US partners alone, all through that Five Eyes construct, which space is sort of rather intimately woven. The Royal Air Force, as I said, has absolutely leapt at this now, and with the Carbonite 2 programme is investigating how we take advantage of what industry has to offer, looking at small satellite constellations. Once again, small satellites, you can launch them relatively quickly and build resilience into systems, as opposed to one or two very large, very expensive, maybe slightly vulnerable satellites. And the Skynet 6 programme will start delivering from 2022 onwards, but we're already heavily into that. With industrial partners, the international dimension, I just quote one example, which is a couple of years old now, but I think it's still relevant. Taking David Parker, when he was the Chief Executive of the UK Space Agency, in to see General Shelton, 4-star commander of US Space Command, who we had half an hour booked to his busy diary, gave us an hour and a half, and he was waxing lyrical about Surrey Satellites, who just opened an office in Denver, I think they probably still have. And he was saying what a wonderful business model we could reuse his company, and that was from an American gentleman. And as I look ahead, without broadening the discussion here, you can see how all sorts of technological trends are going to be affecting us, very much me, my job in force development, artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., etc. But core to all that are capabilities that are delivered by space, which we absolutely rely on for precision navigation and timing, communications, and for intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance. And that is driving everything that we do now. So space, as I say, at the heart of everything we do. So my message is we're operating in a contested environment. It's adversaries who are making it difficult for us to operate there and could make it even more difficult. And we absolutely rely on our international partners and our partners across industry to allow us to compete in that contested environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Marshal. Well, a lot of very interesting insights, a lot to take a lot of thought. Just to get a sense of how many people in the audience are keen to ask questions, I'm sure. I think we'll move straight into that now. I know the Minister is also present.
I'm okay so far, but I'm keeping a slightly weather eye. The reason I'm checking my phone is because we're actually on a whip. And I may have to dash out, but we're okay for the time being. So it's far away.
Yeah, so I'll take a couple of questions, one here. Second.
Thank you. So a few days ago, Gavin Williamson suggested that post-Brexit, the UK might collaborate with some non-EU partners in space areas. You mentioned Japan, Korea, and Australia as potential options. Does the panel believe that post-Brexit we should collaborate with non-EU partners, or should we be doing things more alone, or the European Union at a global level? And if we have collaborations, for what sorts of activities and collaborations are most relevant? Are we talking about military applications, low orbital transport systems, communications, asteroid mining, weather modification, who knows what? In what areas are different kinds of collaboration most relevant?
Thank you. Could you also state your name and organization, please?
Andrew Lillico from European.
Thank you very much. And we had a second question over there.
Professor Gabriel from the National Centre for Atmospheric Science and Cranfield University. We've obviously all been watching the news with regards to Galileo, which I think we're also all well aware is massively over time and budget already, and it does look somewhat like a solution looking for a problem. With the discussion about a UK centric GNSS capability, presumably if we separate out of Galileo, what will that look like, and actually how good an idea is it when there are at least two GNSS systems we could be using, and does Britain really need to be doing that, or just get on with something that might have much greater tangible benefit?
Okay, excellent. Would you like to start?
Sure, yeah. So I think from a government standpoint, those are two great questions. On the point that Andrew raises, of course, we've run our military relationships over the years on many different bases through NATO and the relationship with the US and through security through Five Eyes, etc., as well as through relationships with European nations. And I don't see any reason why that, as it were, eclecticism shouldn't continue. On the commercial side, I think it very much depends on what aspects of commercial activity you're talking about. If you're talking about, launching sites and use of other people's airspace and all the rest of it, that's one thing. If you're talking about different forms of technology sharing, scientific cooperation and others, then that's another. And I would defer to both of the other panelists on those two other sides. On the Galileo point, as you would appreciate, this is subject to some pretty heavy machinery at the top of government in different ways, and I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to comment. But on the merits of the points you make, but it certainly is true that we brought a lot of value to that project, and we'd like it to continue.
I think from my perspective, from an industrial one, Japan and Korea and Australia are very active at the moment. Australia certainly in the last 2 or 3 years has become increasingly active in the space domain. They are talking about setting up their space agency, so there's a huge interest. I think there's already collaboration. JAXA, for the Japanese space agency, already collaborate internationally across the science community, space exploration community. And I was in Tokyo a few weeks ago talking to the new head of JAXA, continuing to want to push for work both internationally, but also develop their own technology and skills. But also recognising that space situational awareness was a key topic. So going back to the comments made earlier, I think all the international partners are beginning to understand that collaboration in space is an extremely valuable topic. Sharing space situational awareness data, but also sharing some of the other space technology and capability. And you can imagine from that particular region of the world, space-based early warning is a natural topic that they're highly interested in. But communication satellites, they're very active. They've got some very great commercial companies that not only build the large systems, but also build some of the infrastructure. Going to the question on Galileo, and I speak as an ex-head of programs for a navigation business area in my past, and obviously in one of my former roles, Surrey built the payloads for Galileo, so which I'm hugely proud of the capability that the UK has had in that system. I think the UK's got some tough challenges ahead. It's got a tough negotiation around Brexit. That project has been going on for a long period of time, so a lot of the industrial transfer of capability and knowledge is within the overall system. I think one of the things that the UK government need to recognise is what are the requirements they're trying to satisfy. There are other systems, there are other ways of doing in navigation. You can have your own national space-based navigation system. You can add augmented payloads onto other communication satellites. So I think we need to understand what are the requirements, what's the real need from a protected mode of those kind of navigation systems, but also what access will we still have to Galileo, because the chipsets that go into most future smartphones are already enabled with GPS, Galileo. So for the average user, they will still benefit from the fact that there's a Galileo satellite navigation system.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. During one of the funding crises in the MOD, and I realise that doesn't pin it in space and time for anybody, I hosted a lunch for the Deputy Assistant Director for Space from the Pentagon, and the money men from the MOD came down, free lunch and all that. But their ears absolutely pricked up when this guy offered free capability. And he was talking about, with international collaboration, if you just do things like move orbits, you can build resiliency, which actually is another way of building capability, whereas we had just put things in quite simple orbits. That's what I said, the previous paradigm. It's not contested, just do the obvious and easy thing. And of course, we had GPS, so we just built chips that looked at GPS. Well, there's a bicycle computer I have on my bike will track at least 2 different GPS systems, and therefore it's got slightly better redundancy than some of the old military kit that we had. And of course, the Russians would use GPS as well as GLONASS, and why not? You just pointed out that for no money at all, put a different chipset in. So if you have Galileo and GLONASS, and you've got all sorts of redundancy in there, and you are building resilience into your system. So I don't want to put a price on that. I don't want to get into the debate over Galileo or not. Clearly, that is part of government's Brexit negotiation. I'll leave that to the minister to talk about. But as for international collaboration, yes, absolutely. I'm surprised the man from Lockheed Martin has not mentioned F-35 yet. And other bits and pieces, because partners of the Pacific are buying it, and there's a platform dependent on space. I could well see us getting into partnerships there. And I'll just finish by saying, and we've already started to do this sort of thing. I know we moved at least one of the Skynet 5 constellation around to provide better communications for our allies in the Western Pacific at one point, when they lacked a bit of resilience and redundancy. And so I just throw out there that actually our ability to move things in space and do things in cyberspace allows you to help your allies, who are literally halfway around the globe, and it allows you therefore to make an alliance contribution without maybe some of the more expensive, more obviously physical deployments of military force that would have been necessary in the past.
Thank you for making the comment that if you space enable the comms to an F-35, you get a far better platform.
Great. Could I have a question from West and
Yes, Admiral West, Civil Sailor. In the 80s, I was very involved with with NRO and the Black programs, and we did an awful lot of work with the Americans, and that work has developed, and it's become clear to me as Galileo was being thought of and work was going on, the Americans there was a sort of schizophrenic sort of flavour about it. There are a number of offers that the Americans have been making and are making to us. How do the panel see this linkage to the United States, certainly post-Brexit? The offers of a man like Trump there might well dry up rather quickly. How do they see that going, and how important do they believe that is? Because that historically has been where our real closest work has been with our very closest allies.
thank you. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Hugh Critchley, I'm a researcher in Parliament. Following on from the question about dealing with the Americans earlier, do you think after we leave the EU, we'll have a more or less of an opportunity to negotiate with the Americans on things like the ITAR regulations, which might allow our fast-growing space industry to export to some of our American partners in that market there?
Thank you very much. We'll take a third question.
Dan Bloom from the Daily Mirror. Just a little more on Galileo. How damaging do you think it would be for Britain and British firms if Britain and the EU drift apart on cooperation on Galileo, particularly, and this is one from Patrick Wood, reports today that tech firms could be blocked from transferring sensitive information to the EU, given all that you said about the importance of close cooperation?
Few challenging questions.
I mean, there's very little I can say on these, I think. I mean, operational details of previous relationships with the US are really a matter for the MOD rather than for me within the Department of Transport. I have no doubt, let's be clear, we want to continue the Galileo arrangement. We think that it has enormously benefited from UK content improvements in different ways over the years. We have been clear about our commitment to security more widely and across Europe, and it's something that I believe will reach a resolution on. But I'm not going to comment further on that. And I think it's really a matter for others to say what the commercial environment will look like after. The point I would make is it's very dynamic, and it's becoming more dynamic as a result of the space industry build, the effect of which has been to put some real energy behind the commercial initiatives that were really underway.
I think from my perspective, I mean, there is strong cooperation between the UK and the US, particularly in the existing use of GPS systems, so the GPS-3 system that's the current system that's in build. I think that has already demonstrated the power of that strong relationship. I think one of the strongest ways going forward is how do we look at the next generation of space-based navigation. We've already heard that space is a contested environment. The space protection that's going to be required to be built into the next generation, that is about internationally sharing that knowledge and expertise around. And I think that's a great example of where the US and the UK could collaborate enormously in the future to bring some of the very specialist space domain security knowledge, space protection knowledge that the US has, and transition it into UK-based technology that could develop into future navigation systems. So I think there are really great opportunities. There was a question about ITAR. ITAR is a topic that the space industry is incredibly familiar with, export controls as well as the International Treaty on Arms Regulation. Driven by the fact that a lot of the technology that we build into even commercial satellites is a dual-use technology. So it is a subject that is very tightly controlled. I think the US has shown great presence in recent years of looking at what is on the ITAR controlled list and making sure that it's not just adding things onto that list, that they are there for a reason, and that the correct controls are in place when that technology is exported. And that's essential for all our protection, that we are protecting this very complex technology that has a very clear dual use. On the question about the sort of relationship between the EU and Britain, we're right in the middle of a very complex negotiation. And I think any of us who could look into our crystal balls and see what the future brings is going to be very, very dangerous to make a comment. But I think the industry, the UK space industry has grown up. It's been part of Europe. It is part of the European awareness. Most of the companies that work in the UK are very familiar with working on European Space Agency projects. Galileo is actually an EU project that was originally started as an ESA project. So ESA acts as the design authority. So it is a complex project, even in the world of European space industry. I think a small glitch along the way is how we should see that. There will be a negotiation as part of the Brexit, but I think the industry will carry on and function. There is the scientific world that we talk about, the commercial, and as well as the defence side. So all of those aspects are UK space companies are very well positioned for, and they will continue to flourish and grow.
you mentioned the National Reconnaissance Office, didn't you, in your question, NRO. And you'll be aware of the decades-long linkages there, and you'll be aware of the relationships. I've said, yes, we get, as I mentioned earlier, billions of pounds of imagery, but also we do a lot of quite clever processing with that, and therefore it's a two-way stream when it comes to value added. And that deep relationship between the military and the intelligence services has lasted all sorts of political administrations and change and hiccups in the surface level. I didn't see that changing at all. It's the bedrock of Five Eyes intelligence sharing group is really the bedrock of our security and the bedrock of defence. That didn't change. When it comes to Europe and Galileo, I do not know when the negotiations are or what secondary concerns may be impacting at the moment, and I won't speculate on that. But just thinking about it more broadly, and quoting a very recently retired, extremely senior French general, European defence is a nicety, the defence of Europe is a necessity. And when you consider how much we share with our European allies, it does seem odd that certain security questions are raised over something like Galileo. I'm sure those are not insurmountable. As the reasons outlined earlier, then I'm sure we would want to stay part of that project and program, and there will be ways of doing that. I won't mention ITAR because I don't have any specialist knowledge in this area.
Thank you. Could I have a question here in front, and then right.
Just a simple question. How close are we to creating biodomes or food farming and pharmaceutical manufacturing to be sustained in space? And if this is the next 20 years, what percentage of the budget has been set aside for it?
John Burke-Haskell is also Vice Chairman of Eutelsat. The exact question that drew me and probably many of us here was, how can the UK be a leader in this sector in Europe? So the question possibly even for the chair of the panel as the scholar amongst us, could you or your fellow parliament say something about the overall economics of the industry, what economic value the space sector in the UK currently represents, what proportion of that is the proportion of the European space industry? We are, on the face of it, the French have a launcher, and there are many other countries in the world that have launchers we don't. We have a significant satellite operator in Marshal, but clearly not one of the world's biggest. Is the proposition that the UK can develop a lead in applications? I'm afraid I'm not able to understand what the navigation path to European leadership is.
Thank you. Very good question. And I'll take a third in the back for it.
I'm Robert. I work for Force Exchange. In fact, my question actually on the horizontal level. The thing that I'm intrigued by, the European space program and the UK's role within it, is how do you benchmark Europe and UK versus other big space players? One thinks of Russia historically, one thinks of the United States, obviously, increasingly one thinks of China. Perhaps one should also, because of the particular emphasis that India has had right back from the time of Nehru, the Indian space program, how would you benchmark Europe and UK versus those?
Thank you. I think I'll leave with Patrick.
Start with an attempted answer on biodomes. I mean, we're doing research on Mars Base Camp, so going to Mars, deep space transport, building on the capability of Orion and the Habitat module. So those are existing projects, and how do we develop into the future? I think those kind of missions are talked about in the 10 to 20 year timescale. So I think biodomes are a great concept that I'm sure that we will get there. I suspect we're talking in excess of the 20 year timeline that you mentioned. I think we're talking probably, if I dare guess, the 30 or 40 years. But that's mostly because the exploration of going back and exploring the moon or the Mars, that will take period of time to develop some of that technology. There are some great companies out there that are pushing the boundaries very rapidly to develop that. I come back to some of those key building blocks like the Orion module and the Habitat module that's being built, which is, again, coming back, a collaboration between different space agencies, between NASA and the European Space Agency and other space agencies. So I hope we see that, but I'm doubtful in my time, even in my timeline, to do that. Some great questions. How do we become the leader in Europe? The overall economics. So the UK space industry has grown rapidly since if we started collecting accurate data probably back in about 2000. So I think it's grown now to about 6 to 7% of the world market. It's at about 15 billion. I was just trying to think of the current probably pounds. Turnover of the 15 billion is the complete size. So we are growing. We've grown enormously. The challenge that the space agency has had with its goal of getting to 10% is a great goal, because it's galvanized everybody in the direction that growth is important and collaboration is important if we're to get there. I think you mentioned the inevitable question about French launches. I think actually it's a European Space Agency launch capability. It just happens to be very CNES controlled. I've launched 4 Ariane 5 ECA. I've put a satellite onto 5, and one of the few people that's put a Union Jack on the side of an Ariane 5. I can tell you very proudly. Much to the grumblings of certain other countries. But the French launchers are designed at a different market. So even if you take the Vega one, it's 1.7 ton to, if I get my facts off the top of my head, into LEO orbit. Then you've got the Soyuz launcher, and you've got obviously the Ariane 5, which is capable of putting 10 tons into GTO, so geosynchronous orbit, or 20 tons into LEO orbit. So those have been aimed at the institutional large and also the large commercial telecommunication satellites. But the UK niche is around small launch. So I know from many of the bids that have been put into to the UK Space Agency looking for that 50 million grant that is really there to stimulate the commercial space market. That's most of those launch vehicles are in the couple of 100 kilogram market. So that's really aimed at small sats. How do we stimulate these nanosats and small sats, and potentially a replacement launches of things like Carbonite in the future, or other Earth observation satellites that might exist. So I think there's great opportunities. There is a huge knowledge and capability that we have in the UK. We're heavily involved in large numbers of European Space Agency projects. We're involved in every area of the European Space Agency, from manned space, space exploration, telecommunications, navigation, pure science and research. Those areas, if we grow to the ambition level that we have, we will challenge our position in the overall European region. And we have the ability to stretch that goal and become the leader. We can do this. What we need is to continue working closely with government, but also making sure that our commercial industry is very active. You mentioned very successful commercial telecoms company Inmarsat. They've grown from a very small origin to the size of the company they have now. There are other telecommunication companies in the UK, so there are opportunities to grow from very small startups up to enormous companies. Then there was a kind of follow-on question about the collaboration, or how do we benchmark ourselves against other nations. I think you started by mentioning Russia. Maybe the easiest answer is when you go and see some of the hardware, and I've seen the simulation of the docking of the automated transfer vehicle into the International Space Station, I can tell you that the European technology is considerably more advanced than the Russian docking mechanism. And in fact, the first time they tried it, it didn't work, because actually you need to go and slam the thing into a Russian docking mechanism for it to work. Might get a rude comment from someone there, but so I think we have the ability. One thing we work is to some agreed international standards. So the NASA space standards European Space Agency ECSS standards, and also the equivalent in JAXA, mean that people can benchmark themselves inside the industry and inside the academia and base knowledge. But I think we are seeing some new countries really pushing hard. India is wanting to do more collaboration. They've gone and put probes onto the moon. They've got a very active navigation industry. They've got an active communications industry. And sometimes it is hard initially to compare ourselves between what is the benchmark we have within the European community compared to some of the others. But space is one of those areas where we do a lot of collaboration. We set up projects that work across country boundaries, and that's a great way of sharing that technology and know-how. So I think typically we've worked very successfully internationally, both within Europe but also globally, and that's led us to the ability to do that kind of benchmarking.
Well, yes, no, well, I'm. That was a tour de force by Patrick. I'm maybe going to add a few grace notes to that. But I'm afraid on biodomes I have nothing to add. But I'm very open to interesting ideas about how we can speed up their deployment at a sensible cost to the taxpayer.
And building the transport system around them.
If any, yes. Yes, it's the commercial opportunities I'm really interested in. So we've had several questions. So the first question is about how can we be leader in this area, and then the second question is about how to benchmark. Let me start with the benchmarking question. I think Patrick's absolutely right. You know, there are crude measures of doing it. You can look at turnover, you can look at the industry, you can look at number of launches. What's really interesting is the qualitative measures that look at quality of technology, how that's being deployed, in what commercial areas, across what sectors. And I guess the point I would make in response to Lord Burke's very good highlighting of the exam question is that, of course, no one in any dynamic market can ever say actually how it's going to develop, because uncertainty is an irreducible part of our lives. But what we can say is that there's an enormous amount of opportunity and resilience out there at the moment. And we're not just talking about the small satellite capabilities, which are of enormous interest across the world at the moment, as Patrick said. We're also talking about other forms of payload. We're talking about the telecoms technologies that sit behind them. We're talking about, of course, all of the subsystems that lie behind that. We're talking about the testing facilities, Harwell. We're talking about investments in that. And I think across all that, and that's before we even talk about, spaceports and the actual location of launches here. And the point really goes back to a point that was made earlier, I think, which is we can watch Falcon Heavy and marvel at Elon Musk and what's happening in those kinds of areas, but actually this stuff is potentially right on our doorstep, and we've just got to really step forward now and try to make that happen. And I think government's trying to do that, but the quicker we can press home that early advantage and use some of the possibilities that are latent in this very wide-ranging, resilient set of technologies, then I think the better for all of us. We don't know what the route will be, but we can be rationally comfortable that there's a very prosperous future if we just get on with it.
You don't have many biodomes in military defence. You have a few biohazards, and I know I've shared a slip trench with a few of them on it. It's a very interesting question, though, isn't it? Because when you talk about the state-based industries, they were there. They were big, heavy state-based in NASA and the Russian effort, and they were demonstrations of national political virility, really. And what we're talking about here, though, is that the cost of entry to this is coming down, and also what you're seeing is some of the imagination of the private sector coming up to meet it. And in fact, we just in the way the other day had to think through what is it that SpaceX brings and what is it that NASA brings, what's the difference between the two, where the advantage is to be had. And I think somewhere in there, the answers there, as we develop those, is the answer to your question. And I refer to my opening remarks and how can we gain some leadership. I think if we can sort of think through the linkages across government, where the military does link into the emerging market. In fact, as both other panelists have said, this isn't just about big rockets and symbols, very obvious symbols of virility in the rocket. This is about all the other elements as well that you have to stitch together to make a valid space enterprise. And I've already mentioned some of the companies, and I don't need to mention them again. I think there is a very vibrant UK enterprise and an industrial base that can be grown. And I think the only figure that we haven't quoted so far, certainly from memory, I just checked it, we were aiming for 40 billion. That 10% is roughly about 40 billion turnover by 2030 was the target the government set. And when I last looked, I think we are reasonably on track to make that if the growth rate continues. So, I mean, to sum all that up, I think there's an interesting balance here between how government steers what it can do and the agencies it does own, and I just happen to represent one of those here today, without having to build something huge and monolithic like NASA to create a launch capacity that might be a little bit passe these days.
Thank you. Perhaps it's also worth reflecting on some of these barriers to growth, some of the risks that might come up. For example, one issue that is often raised is that of the skills base. In order to grow an industry that reaches 40 billion, you'll need to have many more really skilled people working in the industry at a time when other skills-intensive industries, robotics and so on, are also set to grow and draw upon that resource. So that is one of them, and another one is space situational awareness, as we've mentioned several times. But now we're looking at potentially thousands of more satellites being launched in the next 10 years, mega constellations, and there are serious risks that come from that in terms of space security and safety and safe operation of spacecraft. So there are some uncertainties around all of those. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on some of the risks to that growth?
I mean, we're kind of short of time, so I don't want to take too much time, Gabriel. And your clock would never have happened in my day, but that clock is actually a few minutes slow. But what I would say is, listen, we're going to crack the skills problem in this country, and the way we're going to do it is by transforming the teaching of engineering in higher education. The way we're going to do that is by everyone trooping down to Hereford and looking at the new Model Institute of Technology and Engineering, which we're building there, which is exploring all of the best new ways to educate the next generation of engineers on a 50-50 gender basis. So that's how I'm going to fight that problem. What was your other problem, Gabriel? Apart from, I'm sure there's a Hereford solution or whatever it is.
Space traffic management?
Space traffic management, well, it's absolutely fine. Security, we've got the best security in Herefordshire on the planet. Don't worry about that.
I think that's a great answer on the skills base. I mean, we have some challenges in that. I think everybody is working very hard. I know that if I go and talk to pretty much everybody involved in the space industry, they all recognise the importance of STEM, stimulating the students to stay on the right subjects. That message is very well understood, and I think, in my experience of having been involved in a number of the companies across the space industry in the UK, there's a very active bunch of STEM ambassadors that go out and send those strong messages, but actually technology institutes that will actually really drive that. I think the pushing the apprenticeships and the engineering apprenticeships are extremely positive messages, and we just need to continue to push those messages. And I'm glad you mentioned increasing the diversity in the engineering community, because that's definitely changed over the decades that I've been involved in the space industry for the better. When you're working in dynamic teams that have to work in across international boundaries, having a diverse workforce helps enormously in being able to work effectively across those boundaries. Space situational awareness is an incredibly important topic. I can go back to my previous role as a CEO, waiting for a conjunction warning that I can still remember. It was 2 minutes past 11. The two spacecraft were going to pass within a statistical that they were going to be 200 meters apart, with a statistical probability that they might only be 30 meters apart. I tell you, space is a domain that we have to take really seriously. If you've got commercial assets up there, or you've got national infrastructure assets, space situational awareness is essential in whatever orbit. And we talk a lot about mega constellations. The industry needs to be responsible about how it's going to construct and manage and own those mega constellations, because the impact of a collision in that kind of orbit can be catastrophic. So that's my statement on space.
Very realistic take.
Yeah, skills. It's something that's energised this Chief of Defence Staff, who's moving on. I think he's speaking here next month. And he has been very active in looking at the UK skills base and working with government. Because everywhere I look, and I mentioned in my introduction some of the areas we're interested in, I do not see how we will be able to retain service from having trained unless we have some very flexible career paths. Just two cyber and nuclear engineers would be the two areas, and you can throw space into that as well. So there's an area there, and I see now as Director General of the Defence Academy, I'm very interested in how we train my youngsters, and I will be looking at how we can work across government but work with industry as well to find enticing career paths, because this is a very exciting area to go into. If then they can, some of the more entrepreneurial can see that as their bedrock, if they can get the finance, if they can start the sort of companies that seems to be easier to start in the US than it is over here, and if we can then retain them, I think that might go some way to answering your question about how you grow this industry. It does start with the people, it does start with the skills, and I think there is a role for all of us in government. And I would say, it's easy for me to say that, it is my plug, if we're going to be saved by the Bell Minister. It's RAF 100 this year, and when you go back and think of the 20s and 30s, Trenchard picked the forgotten elements in society. My granddad, the fifth sibling down the line that couldn't afford to go to grammar school, had to go on the payroll, put them into apprenticeship schemes and took the top three and put them into the fast track and the yearly officer course at 15-20% of the Crown Royal Academy in the 20s and 30s in between the wars were people who hadn't even got the certificate of education. One of them, Frank Whipple, went off to Cambridge University, having joined as an apprentice to be an airman. And then we know where that led. So we need to think about that thinking. That was very imaginative at the time. Maybe the Army could think about that. We're at the point of the next CGS. You never know. Might not be an Elefteriu next. My point is, by thinking back, and we are thinking about that in the centenary of RAF 100, I'm just pointing out that society greatly benefited from all of that social mobility, as well as the forward thinking that went with the new technological service. And we can hark back and think through the Air Force, what it's achieved, but I hope what it does, and what I hope the rest of defence does, is think forward 100 years. It says what made it such a vibrant environment, what allowed it to generate things, radar, jet engine, etc., the magnetron, that were globally leading technologies that took us through the Second World War. So I think there is a role for us in skills, in education, in working in industry, and we should look back to look forward.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I think we'll bring this event to a close. We've been running over time a bit. Thank you very much for coming. Could you join me in thanking